John lived a carefree and nonchalant lifestyle and didn't believe in love. His father, frustrated by his lack of responsibility, cut him off from his wealth, demanding that he become responsible and find a wife. In response, John paid a woman to pretend to be his wife. You won't believe what happened next. Kindly subscribe to this channel and watch until the end to find out. Mr. Gilbert was a wealthy and respected businessman living in Lagos. His success and reputation were admired by many, but his personal life was a different story. He had one son, John, who was a constant source of worry. Unlike his father, John had no interest in the family business or taking responsibility. Instead, he spent his days partying and living a carefree life, often bringing shame to the family. As Mr. Gilbert grew older, he longed for his son to settle down and eventually take over the business. However, John showed no interest in either marriage or the family business, creating significant tension between father and son. One sunny afternoon, John was in his room laughing and chatting on the phone with his friends. The next day, he invited them over, and the group spent the evening dancing, drinking, and playing loud music in the living room. The house was alive with noise and laughter until Mr. Gilbert came home unexpectedly. Shocked by the chaos, he stormed into the living room and switched off the music. "What's going on here?" he shouted, glaring at everyone. The group fell silent, startled by his sudden appearance. John, however, looked annoyed. "Why did you have to ruin our fun, Dad?" he snapped. "In my own house?" Mr. Gilbert thundered. "You are not serious! Everyone get out of here!" Embarrassed, John's friends quickly left. Turning to his father in anger, John retorted, "Why couldn't you just ignore it?" Mr. Gilbert's stern reply was final. "Not under my roof. Now get out of my sight." Fuming, John stormed off to his room. The next morning, Mr. Gilbert was in his office reviewing documents when his secretary informed him of a visitor. To his surprise, it was Chief Adewale, an old friend and business partner. The two men exchanged pleasantries and reminisced about old times. "How's your daughter, Mandy?" Mr. Gilbert asked. "She's fine," Chief replied. "She just got back from abroad and will be home in a week." Their conversation turned to business, but before leaving, Chief mentioned Mandy's interest in reconnecting with John. A few days later, John was at a nightclub with his friends when a heated argument broke out with another patron. The situation escalated into a physical fight, leaving John with several bruises and cuts. He stumbled home late that night, battered and bruised. The next morning, Mr. Gilbert noticed the injuries on his son's face. "John, come here," he called sternly. John tried to avoid him, but his father insisted. "Look at yourself," Mr. Gilbert said, shaking his head in disappointment. "Your mates are out there building their future, and this is what you spend your time doing." It wasn't my fault," John protested. "He started it." "Enough!" Mr. Gilbert shouted. "Get out of my sight!" Later that day, Mr. Gilbert decided to confront John about his lack of responsibility. "John, I need you to go to the office tomorrow and sign some documents for me," he said. "I have a doctor's appointment and can't go myself." John looked at his father in surprise. "I'm sorry, Dad, but I can't. I have plans tomorrow." "Plans?" Mr. Gilbert repeated in disbelief. What could be more important than this? But John excused himself and left the room, leaving his father speechless. A few days later, Chief Adewale stopped by Mr. Gilbert's office again. During their conversation, Mr. Gilbert invited him and Mandy to dinner at his house, hoping to introduce her to John. Chief was thrilled at the idea. When Mandy heard the news, she was overjoyed. She had always had a crush on John since their childhood days. Despite having a boyfriend abroad, she couldn't help but fantasize about reconnecting with him. Excited, she spent hours deciding what to wear. The next evening, at the Gilbert residence, the dinner table was beautifully set and the cook, Mary, was busy preparing the meal. Mr. Gilbert greeted Chief and Mandy warmly when they arrived. As they sat down to eat, Mandy eagerly asked, "Where's John?" "He's in his room," Mr. Gilbert replied. Before Chief could finish commenting on John's absence, John appeared, descending the stairs. For the first time, he seemed to show some respect, greeting Chief and Mandy politely. Mandy was stunned at how much John had changed since their childhood. She couldn't take her eyes off him, and John noticed but chose to ignore her. As the meal continued, Mandy's attention remained fixed on John. Just then, John's phone rang. He excused himself and left the table to take the call. Mandy was visibly disappointed at how abruptly he left, but the evening continued with light-hearted conversation and laughter. What will happen next? Will John realize the importance of his father's business and responsibility? And what role will Mandy play in his life? The story unfolds with themes of family, duty, and unexpected romance. After lunch, John stepped out onto the balcony, scrolling through his phone, absent-mindedly. Moments later, Mandy joined him. She leaned on the railing and said with a smile, "John, you've really changed." He glanced at her briefly and replied, "Same here." Encouraged by his response, Mandy reached out, trying to touch his arm, but John quickly pulled away. Without a word, he turned and walked back inside, leaving her speechless and hurt. A few days later, Mandy was shopping at a local supermarket when she spotted John. Excited, she waved at him, signaling for him to come over. Surprised to see her, John walked over and they exchanged pleasantries. Mandy smiled brightly and said, "John, it's so good to see you again. I really miss our friendship. Can we hang out while I'm still in town?" John hesitated, not wanting to hurt her feelings, even though he didn't share her enthusiasm. "Sure," he said reluctantly. Mandy then asked for his contact information and he gave it to her before quickly leaving. The next evening, Mr. Gilbert was on the phone with Chief Adewale when John came downstairs, looking for his car. After checking outside, John returned, clearly frustrated. "Dad," he said, interrupting the call, "I can't find my car. Where is it?" Mr. Gilbert ignored him, continuing his conversation with Chief. This infuriated John. "Dad, I hope this isn't what I think it is." Chief, overhearing the commotion, asked Mr. Gilbert if everything was okay. "Let me call you back," Mr. Gilbert said before ending the call. Turning to his son, he said, "What's your problem, John? Can't you see I was on the phone?" "My problem? Where is my car?" John demanded. Mr. Gilbert leaned back and replied calmly, "Oh, you mean the car I bought? That car is gone until you learn to work for yourself and stop wasting your life on nonsense." John was stunned. His father continued, "Look at you, a grown man with no direction. Your mates are out there building their futures, getting married and starting families. When are you going to grow up?" John snapped, "Dad, don't even start about marriage. All women are fake. They pretend to love you, but they don't." Mr. Gilbert was taken aback. "Is that what you believe? Just because your mother cheated doesn't mean all women are the same." "Exactly, Dad. They're all the same. Just let me live my life the way I want," John yelled before storming upstairs. The next day, Mandy and John went out for coffee. Mandy, trying to rekindle their friendship, was cheerful and talkative, but John was distant. Despite her efforts to make him comfortable, he couldn't see her as someone he could be interested in. In his mind, this outing only confirmed his belief that women couldn't be trusted. Weeks later, John's carefree attitude hadn't changed, and Mr. Gilbert was growing desperate. He confided in Chief Adewale, explaining his frustration with John's refusal to take responsibility. Chief nodded knowingly. "I noticed his behavior the first day I met him. If you want him to change, you need to take tough measures. Cut him off. Restrict his access to the things he takes for granted until he gets a wife and makes something of himself." Mr. Gilbert was hesitant. "I can't do that, Chief. He's my only son." "Exactly. That's why you need to act now. If you let this continue, he'll ruin everything you've built," Chief insisted. After much thought, Mr. Gilbert decided to take Chief's advice. The next day, Gilbert called his lawyer. "I want you to hold off on adding John's name to any of my properties or businesses until I give the go-ahead," he instructed. "Is everything all right, sir?" the lawyer asked. "Everything's fine. I just need time to sort things out," Mr. Gilbert replied before ending the call. Later that day, John discovered his bank account had been frozen. Furious, he rushed home and confronted his father. "Why are you doing this to me?" John shouted. "Why are you trying to ruin my life?" Mr. Gilbert, calm but firm, replied, "I'm doing this because I want you to wake up. If you don't get married and take responsibility, consider everything gone. I'm giving you 2 months to find a wife, or you can forget about the business, the property, and me." John stood in shock. "Dad, you can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," Mr. Gilbert said, walking away. A few days later, with no money and no help from his friends, John felt isolated. As he sat in his room, an idea struck him. What if I pay someone to pretend to be my fiancée? Excited by the thought, he reasoned, this way I can make my dad happy, get access to the property, and still live my life the way I want. Feeling like he had found the perfect solution, John began planning his next move, but would this plan work or would it backfire? On a bright morning, John was driving through town, speeding recklessly as usual. He suddenly hit the edge of a fruit hawker's stand, almost knocking her over. The woman, startled, quickly stepped aside to avoid further harm. Instead of apologizing, John rolled down his window and yelled, "Are you blind? Can't you see where you're going?" The fruit seller, a young woman named Sandra, was shocked by his audacity. She glared at him but decided not to escalate the situation. "He must have some issues," she thought, turning back to arrange her scattered fruits. John, however, had an idea. Wait a minute, this might actually work to my advantage, he thought. Pulling over, he got out of his car and approached Sandra. "Hey, I'm sorry," he said awkwardly, his tone much softer now. Sandra ignored him, still angry. "What do you want now? Haven't you done enough?" "I know I was wrong. Please just hear me out," John pleaded. Reluctantly, Sandra stopped what she was doing. "All right, what is it?" "I'm busy." John hesitated for a moment, then said, "Can we go somewhere more comfortable to talk?" "I really need your help." Sandra was wary, but also kind-hearted. After some hesitation, she agreed. "Fine, but make it quick. I don't have all day." They got into John's car to a nearby restaurant. As they sat down, Sandra kept her guard up, staring at John suspiciously. Breaking the silence, John said, "I have a big favor to ask. I need you to pretend to be my wife for 2 months." Sandra's jaw dropped. "What? Are you serious? I can't do that." John leaned closer, speaking in a low, pleading tone. "Please, just listen. It's not what you think. My dad wants me to get married before he hands over his business to me. I don't want to get married for real, so I just need someone to pretend." Sandra shook her head in disbelief. "This is crazy. I don't even know you." John, sensing her hesitation, made his pitch sweeter. "I'll pay you 5 million naira, half now and the rest when the job is done." Sandra's eyes widened at the mention of the money. That amount could change her life, but she didn't want to seem too eager. 5 million, she asked, pretending to be indifferent. "Yes," John confirmed, pulling out an envelope. "Here's 2.5 million to start with." Sandra stared at the envelope, her mind racing. After a moment, she sighed and said, "Fine, what do I need to do?" John explained the plan, adding that she should come to his house the next day to meet his father. Sandra reluctantly agreed and left with the money in hand. The next day, John woke up feeling unusually excited. He was confident his plan would work. As he went downstairs, he greeted his father with an enthusiasm Mr. Gilbert had never seen before. "Dad, good morning," John said cheerfully. Mr. Gilbert raised an eyebrow. "What's gotten into you? Is everything okay?" John grinned. "Everything is perfect. I found the one, Dad. I found my wife." Mr. Gilbert nearly dropped his coffee. "Are you serious? That's the best news I've heard all year." He called out to the cook. "Mary, prepare a special meal. My future daughter-in-law is coming over." John smiled nervously, hoping everything would go as planned. Sandra arrived later that afternoon, dressed elegantly. As she walked into the house, her radiant smile and graceful demeanor caught John off guard. He found himself staring at her for a moment, thinking, "Wow, I didn't know she could look this beautiful." Snapping out of his thoughts, he quickly welcomed her and went to fetch his father. When Mr. Gilbert saw Sandra, he was impressed. "Welcome, my dear," he said warmly. "Please sit down." As they sat for dinner, Mr. Gilbert asked Sandra, "So what do you do for a living?" Sandra hesitated, caught off guard by the question. John felt a pang of fear, wondering how she'd respond. "I'm a real estate agent," Sandra said confidently, smiling. John was surprised by her quick thinking. "She's good," he thought. Mr. Gilbert nodded in approval. "That's impressive. It's rare to see young women so hard-working these days." "Thank you," Sandra replied politely. The evening went smoothly, with laughter and pleasant conversation. The following evening, John and Sandra met at a restaurant to discuss their arrangement further. As they talked, John found himself genuinely enjoying her company. "How did you come up with that real estate story?" he asked, smiling. Sandra laughed. "I had to think fast. I didn't want to embarrass you." John was impressed. "You're really smart," he said, staring at her longer than he intended. Sandra cleared her throat, breaking his gaze. Is everything okay? John snapped out of it, embarrassed. Yeah, I'm fine. That night, as John lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Sandra. No, this isn't possible. I can't fall for a fruit seller, he told himself. But his heart told a different story. A few weeks later, John called Sandra to his office. When she arrived, she found him looking unusually serious. Is everything okay? She asked, sitting down. John hesitated, then said, I think I'm in love with you. Sandra's eyes widened. What? For the past few months, you've changed my perspective on so many things. I used to think there were no good women out there, but you've proven me wrong, John confessed. You've made me a better person, and I don't want to lose you. Will you be the woman I've always wanted? Sandra was speechless. She had grown fond of John, but never thought someone like him could truly care for her. After a moment, she smiled and said, Yes, I will. John was overjoyed. They held hands, both feeling like they had found something truly special. From that day on, their relationship blossomed into something real. Sandra was no longer just a hired actress. She was the woman who had taught John the true meaning of love and humility. Together, they built a future filled with hope, trust, and happiness. Guys, I'm sure you enjoyed these interesting Nollywood movie stories. Kindly subscribe to this channel to get more of our latest Nollywood movie stories.